All right, go ahead, Em.
Alrighty. Okay, so for those of you who just joined us since the last time I said Happy New Year and welcome, Happy New Year and welcome to our webinar. Today's topic is metering and telemetry. Some quick housekeeping. Just for these webinars, we like to answer questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature. You're welcome to leave them throughout the presentation. Just know that we probably won't get to them until the end. You will be muted throughout the presentation, but once we get to the Q&A portion, I'll unmute you as needed. Also, just a heads up, this webinar is recorded and the recording will be posted publicly. So yeah, I'll just go through and introduce everyone real quick. The speakers today will be Chris Hickman, David Kathan, and myself. Unfortunately, Suzanne Burton is unable to join us today. So yeah, I'll kick it off. My name's Emily Beeson. I'm the lead developer for FERC 2222 website. And Chris, you want to introduce yourself?
Chris Hickman. I'm the CEO of Collaborative Utility Solutions, our nonprofit group that is supporting the implementation of 2222 and DERs more broadly across the industry. And short intro for David, we'll let him introduce himself, but he is our board chair for the advisory for Collaborative Utility Solutions. David?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I am the board chair. I'm also recently retired in the last several years from FERC. And at FERC, I was the lead on the Order 2222 issues and also demand response issues. So happily be involved with the CUS project.
Great. Okay, thank you both. And I'll kick it off. So before we dive into the good stuff, I'd just like to run through some background information on the 2222 project. For starters, this project is in collaboration with PNNL and is sponsored by the DOE Office of Electricity. As always, the opinions expressed in this presentation are ours, Kathan's, and not necessarily of DOE or PNNL. So as part of this project, we have been issuing bi-monthly reports and bi-monthly webinars like this one. We have a FERC2222.org website where we are tracking policy developments in the states related to FERC Order 2222 implementation and more broadly DER policy. We're also working on white papers on a variety of DER topics. The discussion groups are under construction at the moment, but stay tuned for that new and improved feature. And finally, we have a resource library that is a curated collection of materials that are relevant to DER implementation. This library also includes recordings of past webinars. So if you'd like to revisit any topics that you may have missed, you can check out all those recordings there. And a bit more about the bi-monthly reports. These reports always start out with the current news and developments in the DER policy world. And then we dive into a specific issue in greater detail with the key issue analysis. And finally, we try to include some kind of tip or instruction on how to use the 2222 tracker, which again is on that FERC2222.org website. We have quite a few reports now. So again, if you've missed any, just go check them out on the website. They're a great resource. And here are some screenshots of that FERC2222.org website I keep mentioning. So this is where we post all of our webinar recordings, the white papers, bi-monthly reports, and this is where you can use the policy tracker as well. So this is a great resource to stay up to date with FERC 2222 and DER policy happenings. It's updated regularly, so even if you've seen it once, go out, check it again. We upload things to it all the time. So yeah, definitely use that. And now I will turn it over to David, who will go over recent FERC Order 2222 developments.
Thank you, Emily. Next slide. So in the last couple of months since last time we did a webinar, there's been several developments in FERC Order 2222. First one I want to note is that in October, PJM filed a series of changes with FERC Order 2222 to its tariff and reliability agreement. These changes are largely ministerial and reflect changes to the reliability agreement due to how the RTO calculates electric load carrying capacity and the timing of capacity auctions prior to the 2028 FERC Order 2222 implementation. And FERC has already approved these changes by letter order at the end of November. So that's the major action that's happening at this point on the FERC side. Next slide, please. At the state side, there's been several developments, in particular, following its May 29, 2025 stakeholder meeting, the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission staff is invited comments to be filed on, a set of rules regarding how registration and study process of de-aggregations can participate in wholesale markets via distribution systems. The Maryland PSC requested comments by November 19th on utility reports filed in October related to information technology systems and process planning to implement FERC Order 2222 and speed the development of cost-effective VPPs. A technical conference was held on December 3rd, and that technical conference recording is up on the Maryland website, YouTube website. And then additionally in Maryland, Maryland PSC issued an order addressing utilities' proposed TOU tariff offerings and pilot programs related to the implementation of VPPs programs that were directed by the DRIVE Act. The PSC accepted the utilities' TOU offerings, but is requiring that the utilities refile their VPP and V2G proposals to better align their programs with legislative intent of the DRIVE Act, and they must refile within 90 days of the order. And finally, the Iowa Utility Commission opened a new rulemaking in October 2025 with a stated purpose of allowing participation in wholesale markets by demand response customers, which was previously prohibited. Iowa was one of the opt-out states that in order number 718 had opted out of allowing demand response aggregators to participate. So the proposed rule would require cooperation between utilities and ARCs regarding exchange of customer data to effectuate participation in wholesale markets. A public hearing was scheduled for November, and parties filing comments on or before that date. Now I'm going to turn this back to Chris to introduce the concept, which is really the guts of this meeting. This webinar on metering and telemetry. Chris?
Thanks, David. So one of the fundamental issues, and if you've been tracking with us and participating, we are trying to every other month take off one of the major topics out of kind of a group of kind of 10 to 14 topics that have been identified broadly across the industry as the major issues. Metering telemetry is obviously one of the biggest issues of all, and will fundamentally represent a tipping point of how well something is going to work on a go-forward basis. It's obviously crucial because this is the economic basis of the transaction for the entire utility industry. And so while historically we could collect metering data monthly, we even had meter readers that were really, really, really good, and they could estimate after they'd been on the same route for a year, they could estimate pretty much what's going to happen on consumption. But today everything has changed, right? With AMR first, then AMI, we are now to a point where we don't just do monthly collection. We can even ping meters in real time. Sometimes we bring that data back weekly, sometimes daily, and sometimes even faster than that for a variety of reasons. But that structure of what we've done historically versus what we may or may not need to do in the future is going to be defined by the products and the programs in the market. So if the market requires settlement the day after, the day of, the day, over a week, whatever those requirements are, it's going to change the structure by which we need to collect that data and define some of the telemetry requirements. But this is one of the quintessential tipping points in this discussion where if somebody wants to eliminate the effectiveness of DERs and really fight them, they will try to go to the far end of the spectrum and say, hey, you have to have full telemetry, which makes everything less than fundamentally a megawatt uneconomic because of the cost of putting in that 2-second inbound outbound kind of telemetry for SCADA quality telemetry versus going to the other end of the spectrum and saying, oh, hey, we'll settle up monthly, which doesn't, from a capacity and reliability standpoint, have any meaning to a grid operator if they don't know for a month after an event whether or not this happened. So there's something in the middle that makes all of this work. And that conversation is going to have to be had between the ISOs and the serving distribution utilities with the appropriate regulatory authorities to come to resolution on each one of these issues in each jurisdiction based on the types of products. And as we define those products at the ISO RTO level, a market product or a utility program, there may be different requirements for those utility-based programs versus an ISO market product as well. So there will be a need to be a lot of coordination in this conversation. But the thing that I do want to point out very specifically is this thought process of metering and telemetry is the single biggest way that people can block the ability of DERs to come to market by taking very rigid stances on metering or sub-metering or telemetry requirements. It's the single easiest way for parties to eliminate DERs from effectively participating in market by creating unnecessary requirements or over-the-top requirements for these products. All of these advancements in the existing technologies with AMI, we're getting a very high penetration of AMI across the United States. We are actually trying to work with a group to do an overlay of AMI deployment with actual ISO RTO footprints to see what the percentage-wise overlay of that is. I don't know if we're going to be able to get that done. We'll see if the feds are interested in doing that. But it's just an interesting thing that there's a variety of opinions about who does and doesn't have AMI and what the capability is and all of those different things. And so there may be conversations that happen with each associated respective regulatory authority to have a real conversation about whether or not AMI exists and therefore what the requirements could or couldn't be around that to make sure that you go into that with eyes wide open. And then the last one is just the continuing conflict of data sharing. This is the cash register for the utility. It is a very secured and locked down system from that regard. It has always been something that the utility has been responsible to protect and secure kind of holistically within the framework of our industry. But in the view of today's world, we'll talk a little bit about two examples, ERCOT and Ontario, about how they have handled it in two different ways. But there is an ability to securely share and work with this data, especially if you start moving to more of a common standards approach in this. But this is going to have to be resolved. There are FERC cases, there are other things going on, and resolving this conflict about how this meter data is available to the consumer, to their representative aggregators, to ISOs and RTOs to be able to do this settlement is going to be a key point for the industry to figure out and resolve this conflict going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to David to go through the requirements that have been laid out to date through each one of the structured pieces, and then come back on to wrap up towards the end with some summary information about possible paths forward. David?
All right, thanks, Chris. So I'm going to walk through what FERC Order 2222 requires, and then also walk through some of the the compliance filings and approvals that have happened on that. Then also then follow that with some discussion of some state activity that's needed in this area. So FERC Order 2222 requires each RTO ISO to revise its tariff to establish market rules that address metering and telemetry hardware and software requirements necessary for DERAs, or the aggregators, to participate in RTO and ISO markets. And the Commission provided flexibility to the RTOs and ISOs to establish these requirements rather than prescribing specific or standard requirements. One important note and its reflective fact of the jurisdiction of the FERC is that the DERA, the aggregator, is the market participant in the wholesale markets and is the single point of contact. So therefore, the Commission directed that the aggregator is the entity who will be metered and will be responsible for providing any required metering and telemetry information to RTOs and ISOs, not to individual DERs. And specifically, they did not, require that the DERs be separately metered, and clarified that especially in the California ISO compliance order. They did not require telemetry from individual DERs. The Commission also directed each of the RTO's proposed metering requirements should rely on metering data obtained through compliance with a distribution utility or local regulatory authority metering system requirements whenever possible, for settlement and auditing purposes. A key point there is not saying that you must use the utilities systems, but that to use them rely on them where they are available or they are potentially capable of doing what is necessary. So turning to the RTO ISO compliance, and just FYI, as far as compliance, of the 6 RTOs and ISOs that have filed and or required to file by FERC, there are 3 of them have been fully through their compliance filings, and New York ISO and MISO are near completion on theirs, in that there's a few ministerial and various last-minute adjustments that are needed. So final orders are still going to be needed on those. And then finally, the SPP second compliance order is still outstanding. So that's something that is definitely need to be weighted upon at the SPP level. So looking at each of the individual RTOs and ISOs, they essentially follow the direction provided by the FERC on, that the DERAs are the ones who are going to be subject to metering and telemetry, although there are differences amongst them, and I'll go through them as we go forward. So in California, ISO, the telemetry is required for aggregators providing ancillary services and for the aggregators of 10 megawatts or greater. And CAISO said it will memorialize in this tariff that aggregators can acquire data from their DERs to provide the CAISO with accurate telemetry by any means, including calculation. And that's a key point, is that it is the aggregators is the one responsible to obtaining this telemetry or getting the necessary information in order to provide that telemetry signal. It's not specifying how that will be provided. Moving on to ISO New England. ISO New England compliance tied metering and telemetry requirements for DERs to their new 7 different participation models that they set up as part of their compliance. So each one has different requirements. Ancillary services, for example, will have much more precise requirements. Through several compliance orders and filings, FERC directed and approved additional revisions and compliance to broaden the entities who can provide metering and establish protocols for sharing metering data and to allow sub-metering. And MISO requires telemetry for each individual aggregated resource through the Inter-Control Center Protocol via the Wide Area Network, WAN. And this data must be submitted every 2 seconds for all dispatchable DER aggregations, regardless of size or product. For non-dispatchable DER aggregation, telemetry is scaled to the product. In addition, MISO is flexible on the type of calculation or measurement made to develop a telemetry signal, as long as there are common method used for a single DER group. And NISO required in NISO, aggregators are required to provide multiple streams of telemetry and revenue quality meter data at a 6-second requirement. That's a little different than MISO's 2 seconds for automatic generator control context. But telemetry of individual DERs is not required. And in addition, ISO rules for small DERs under 100 kilowatts are flexible and allows NISO to allow for alternative telemetry methods as long as they provide measured telemetry with a periodicity of 5 minutes or less. PJM, like the other RTOs and ISOs, established
David,
the
can I jump
aggregator.
in there for
Sure.
1 second? Sorry, one quick note on this break of size. Obviously, when things are at 10 megawatts, they need to be effective telemetry. It's affordable. Things can work there effectively. This concept of whether it's 100 kW or 500 kW, whatever that piece is for individual DERs and this alternative telemetry, this is what I was talking about in the introduction about the kind of the right conversation in industry to say, hey, we don't need that stuff to be on a 6-second or 2-second or 4-second kind of turn individually, but the aggregation in total must be presented in that aggregated way and be producing information for us at the ISO in those intervals, even if some of that data isn't coming in as fast for each one of those individual resources. So this is a really, really good example of bridging that gap based on the size of the DERs and making effective policy to be able to implement it. Sorry about that, David.
No, that's great context. Thank you, Chris. And there's a good example is right here when I was starting to talk about PJM, in that in PJM aggregated resources under 10 megawatts who are participating in energy market only are exempt from telemetry requirements. So, that's in trying to find that kind of middle ground on what is necessary, what is, cost effective, et cetera. But PJM did specify that meter data must be submitted within 1 business day. That gets back to Chris's point about how fast the data is needed for settlement purposes. And finally, SPP, in the aggregators and SPP must designate a meter agent for revenue quality metering requirements, and the aggregators must make meter values available to the LSE and distribution utility at whatever granularity they require for reliability. And unlike the other RTOs in SPP, if an aggregator includes demand response, it must be separately telemetered, and metering must be submitted for the demand response performance in addition to the aggregation total. So that's a flavor of where we are right now in terms of the requirements for each of the individual RTOs and ISOs. So a key issue, and Chris already noted this earlier, is sub-metering. So while most of the RTOs and ISOs specify the primary premise meter is the appropriate metering site, with prompting by FERC, several of the RTOs and ISOs will accommodate sub-metering, particularly ISO New England and PJM. Sub-metering is important because it is able to isolate a device operation from the full operation of a premise. So to be able to especially to know what is happening with that particular storage device, there is a ideal, or perhaps even more to get down to the electric vehicle level, you need to have a much more ability to measure what is happening at that particular device. And so that is one of the key things that is really is needed as we move towards further development of metering and telemetry at the DER level. But it turned out it was a major source of controversy in several of the RTOs in particular in the ISO New England. They're resolved at the end, but the DER providers and clean energy advocates had argued sub-metering is essential to capture those device information, and especially because many of them, especially like EVs and others, store and manage charging or other types of devices, already have telemetry that meets prescribed standards. The utilities, on the other hand, argued that the use of sub-metering could result in double counting of energy services, and that customer load must be reconstituted to remove the sub-metered load from the full premise load. Furthermore, the utilities maintain that their current metering configuration would not allow automatic reconstitution, would be burdensome and costly. So that was a whole discussion that went on for several compliances through ISO New England. I believe finally FERC did direct that sub-metering needs to be considered and used in ISO New England. So what it comes down to, there's what I've been mostly speaking about has been at the FERC level, at the RTO and ISO level. So that's about especially how the aggregator needs to interact with the RTO and ISO. So the question is, what is needed in order to allow for the DERAs to operate inside the state and the GERs inside of a state to be able to be aggregated up into an aggregation? What is the various actions that need to be considered in order to make that happen? The first, and I think this is a core requirement, is that an adoption of IEEE 1547 2018. And in this consistency in the application of this standards will enable equipment that can appropriately and effectively integrate and communicate. At this point, in my last check, I've note that only 7 states in the United States have at this point fully adopted IEEE 1547. And I think there needs to be action being taken on this, because this is a much more advanced and capable standard for metering and for also unlocking a number of capabilities inside of DERs. The states need to consider allowing sub-metering. If it doesn't already allow sub-metering, utility codes and regulations may need to be revised to meet the defined goals for DER performance and market interaction. Along with that, developing sub-metering standards, specifically accuracy, certification, utility inspection requirements, etc. And also telemetry infrastructure coordination. State and local regulators should define acceptable communication pathways and technical standards for communication of meter data and also other information at the distribution level, either using the 2030.5 standard or others, just making sure that there's a specified standard that's being used. And then finally, as Chris noted, there is a definite need for state and local regulators to define requirements for fair and effective access to necessary data to enable DERs. This is an open and a very challenging question that is under discussion in multiple states, and I think it needs to be thought through and in detail, especially access to data on the DERs. As far as actual sub-metering actions have been taken thus far, California is the primary state that currently allows sub-metering of DERs. In a decision, the California PUC adopted rules and sub-metering protocols for plug-in electric vehicles, making it the first state to allow separate metering of EVs without installing a separate utility meter. This action sets an important precedent for allowing sub-metering behind the main meter, defining accuracy and communication data protocols, and aligning utility billing and validation system accordingly. Maryland is in the process right now of developing regulations for VPPs and for Order 2222 implementation. As part of that, they are drafting regulations that address device level meters. The use of these device level meters will be allowed as long as they meet appropriate standards, such as ANSI standards for electric meters, C12.1. Just note this is a draft rules. It has not been taken to the commission yet, so it may be subject to change as we go forward. Now I'm going to turn this back to Chris. Chris?
Thank you, David. So as we have talked a little bit going into this, technology is going to really make a lot of this fundamentally simpler. But as everyone, I'm sure on this call knows, adopting technology is a difficult conversation within the utility industry from both a time standpoint as well as a cost standpoint. But we wanted to point out two specific cases around metering and telemetry. The ERCOT case, where they created Smart Meter Texas, a common meter authority, was created to present the meter data to third parties, the retail electric providers, consumers, aggregators, whatever is happening in that marketplace. They've created an aggregated mirror of a data set that is made available to the third parties to enable their marketplace. There was a lot of challenges in this, in that this is actually a mirrored data set. So initially there were different M&V methodologies being used. There was contradictions in the data between the mirror and the actual utility head-in system. And there was a lot of work to get all of that honed out and fixed and put in place. But ultimately, mirroring the data has effectively doubled the cost, right? In the sense of rather than having a system, that you have multiple systems and multiple views of the data. And while it has helped enable different pieces of it, Ontario took a completely different approach, and within the province of Ontario allowed the ISO to own the head end of all of the meter data, so that all of the utilities are responsible for metering, collection, the systems, AMI, and different things, but everything goes to one system, and the utilities use that system to do their billing. The ISO has access to all that data for settlement for any programs at the wholesale level. And there's a single source of truth. And there's some great case studies out there for Ontario about the dramatic cost reductions, IT cost reductions for all the utilities that have been involved there, as well as the ISO, to make this work. Obviously, in our very fragmented space with 3,000 utilities scattered across our 50 states with different regulatory structures and things, it makes it difficult for us. But at some point, within the framework of our industry, we're going to have to stop doing things individually and start being a more collaborative industry again. Through deregulation, we moved away from collaboration, and we're seeing a shift back towards actually having effective collaboration again within industry. And this is one very specific example that could mean billions of savings across the overall industry, and a dramatic simplification going forward in terms of how settlement, sharing, and everything is done, if we can start to work together instead of trying to find ways not to work together. But these IT costs in our industry can't continue to be ever escalating. We're going to have to figure out ways to work together, and this is going to be very, very important for DERs. So this is a very specific example with metering and telemetry, but we did want to point out that as we've worked with all the different federal agencies and groups and all the different countries around the world over the last 5 years, there is a very different way to view 2222. If you pull back and say, hey, we could have 3,000 utilities independently deal with DER implementation in a fully ad hoc fashion, or we could have a rule like 2222 that said, hey, why don't you all work better together and collaborate and try to implement this more holistically to not only enable this new capability to our systems, now that we're dramatically short of capacity in the United States, it's an important add. But this thought process of being able to collaborate more effectively is important. The concept of a nonprofit registry, by state, by ISO, by whatever group level. And there's a tremendous amount of work going on for standards and data structures for that registry and industry across the board right now, all based on this overall SIM construct, or the Common Information Model. And if you're paying attention to Europe, they've basically killed us in the cost reduction strategy. The European marketplace adopted SIM holistically 10 years ago, and they're estimating somewhere upwards of $400 million of software savings, because there is no more software interface conversations anymore, because they can share data through SIM-defined interfaces by having appropriate SIM models in each one of them. So there aren't individual interface costs for every single software system or things that come along. They just said, look, you either be able to present and work with data through the SIM structure, or you can't participate. It is a fundamental help with everything that is going on in our industry to do that. This thought process of having a larger common meter authority could be another multi-billion-dollar piece of this. And then eventually, at some point, this came up in actually several cases across the United States, and has become a topic of conversation, where if you look at a single homeowner, they could be paying a gas AMI charge, and a water AMI charge, an electric AMI charge, something else from their city government. And these are all an overlapping infrastructure where our customers across the United States and our economy as a whole is being severely burdened by communication costs, because everybody wants to do their own separate thing versus having a common communication platform to be able to deal with metering. And there's going to need to be, again, a thought process of much more effective collaboration in the United States if we're to be successful here, and not continue to overburden and create an ever increasing cost of IT systems within our industries, if we can't figure out how to collaborate more effectively. So kind of in summary, for the metering telemetry part of it, please go to the 2222.org website. You can see the white paper there for the monthly report that digs into this in a little bit more detail. But these metering and telemetry decisions that are going to be made by each ISO and by each state are going to be very, very important. People that are being standoffish, that want to challenge the implementation or slow the implementation, are going to try to overburden the thought process of metering and telemetry requirements to limit the ability of participation. People that are on the other end of the spectrum are saying you don't need any of it. The right answer is somewhere in the middle. You do not need 2-second, 4-second, or 6-second telemetry for 100 kW, potentially even 500 kW DERs in the marketplace. And I'm going to do one caveat to that as I finish here, but those policies and these conversations, we need to have a much more effective conversation to be able to enable them. Longer term, as AMI becomes more and more proficient and implemented and has more capability, whether it's 5G or fiber or whatever it is, a lot of these things will fade into the background, because everything will be on a 2-second capable thought process if need be. But there is a transition over the next 20 years that we need to have better conversations. And this opportunity in the industry that 2222 is providing to us is highlighted here with this concept of a common meter authority, with a very clear view of this in Ontario with dramatic savings, dramatic efficiencies, and very simple enablement of market products and programs, because now you have a way that has a fair access to all of that data very efficiently for settlement for whatever that they want to create within that province. And so there's a lot of things that are going to continue to move forward, but we're going to need to have better conversations and more collaborative conversations to make this work. And ultimately, per Aaron's post in the chat, we need your help. The caveat that I mentioned to the size, a lot of people probably don't appreciate when power dorks like me talk about networks. We're talking about a very specific thing. It's not like the network of the United States that is our traditional above ground interconnected grid that is 85 to 92% of the overall wires in the United States. When we talk about a network, you talk about the downtown network in New York, or even my smaller utility, Public Service New Mexico, that I worked at. We did have a small downtown network, but these are things that it is very challenging to manage resources being connected to that type of system. It's very difficult. I'm not sure that I don't personally agree that if you're connected to a true network, that you don't need that 6-second kind of telemetry view of the world, because it is a very, very difficult thing to manage that type of a network safely, securely, and reliably. Out in the traditional infrastructure that exists in the majority of our country, that's just not the case. So there is a distinction based on where you're connecting, how you're connecting. There is some pieces to that, but ultimately, as we move through these conversations, there's always going to be better information. We're doing the best we can to keep track of everything, to keep up with it, but we need your help. Apologize. I'm just coming out of a COVID thing, so let's now answer some questions.
Yeah, so Chris, I see that we've got 2 in the chat. The first one's from Aaron, the second one is from Eric, and then we have also a couple questions in the Q&A section from Jordan. So let's start with the chat questions and then we can move on.
So Aaron, could you give us a little more color? We were under the impression the rule allowed the aggregation in New York for resources under 100 kW, but you say that is not the case. Can you give us a little more information?
It's Aaron Bardenbaugh with C-Power. Hi, everybody. Thanks for this. Yeah, this is one of the big issues that we need to solve. If particularly if you're not, if all the constituents are below the 100 kW, then yeah, you can use alternatives to 6-second telemetry. But if you're above that threshold, then the only thing the NISO, essentially they will insist that the aggregate 6-second signal be traceable back to the constituents, which means you then have to have 6-second telemetry back to the individual site or aggregate level. So, and that's a big issue. It's a huge issue because we're looking at a break even of around, I don't know, conservatively 5 megawatts. And anybody under that, it's not going to make sense to install the telemetry for people to participate. And that's over half of the at least existing demand response, which is what we're focusing on. And right now, the only thing that's in the DER participation model is demand response. And further, it's demand response from crypto miners and data centers.
So, thank you, Aaron. That's awesome. Maybe I don't want to get too geeky here, but for everybody, there's kind of 2 aspects of this telemetry. One is the timing requirement, and one is the security of being able to transact that data. Because sometimes if you say, hey, we need 6-second data, that comes with a very specific requirement of an ICCP connection to the Grid Control Authority. And Aaron is right. We've run all those numbers, and it's traditionally around 5 megawatts before you can make that break even. The costs are significant to do that type of speed of telemetry with a full ICCP secure connection. If you just do 6-second data and say it's just an outbound presentation of data and it can come through a different type of interface, not ICCP, that's probably around a 2 megawatt break even on that structure. But these are very big issues that are going to have to be resolved by different groups going forward. And again, I think that the answer is somewhere in the middle. And I think that you will see the people that are either trying to enable or not enable DER based on the positions that they are taking on these points.
Yeah, one other thing, and I don't think you mentioned it, but it certainly can be an issue, is, and I don't know if anybody else does it, but in New York, there used to be under the DSASP, the predecessor to DER, you could have the telemetry come from the site to the CSP, and then from the CSP to the NISO. Under their DER/Order 2222 implementation, that's no longer possible. The telemetry now has to go from the site to the transmission owner and then to the NISO. It doesn't even go through us. And so to do the kind of aggregation of the telemetry, that would have to happen at the level of the transmission owner. And I very much doubt they're going to volunteer to do that. So it's sort of, again, you're back to the telemetry flowing directly from the constituent members. But that idea of it goes from the site to the utility to the system operator and misses the CSPs altogether is kind of a big deal. I don't know if anybody else does that.
David, that kind of violates the 2222 thought process, doesn't it? With the requirement.
That's what I was just going to say. You know, the fact that seems to be in different than what FERC has directed, in terms of that the DERA is the market participant. Is it specifically associated with the, I know they changed it from the day ahead program and it made it all into one program, with the DE aggregation and the demand response. Is this specific to the demand response portion of this?
No, I think it applies. Certainly that's what we pay attention to because that's
Right.
mostly what we do. But I think it applies to everything. And just like maybe it's a distinction without a huge difference, but I guess not. We are still the market participant. We still offer the resources in, we get the settlements and all that kind of thing. It's the operational telemetry and base points and things like that that have to go, that sort of bypass us. We can see it as it goes by because we have metering at the site, but we can't sort of get in the way of it.
Right. Well, obviously, this is worth further digging. So thanks, Aaron. Well, this is something that does seem potential. I knew in New York and other things, like, for example, the small, resources are not really capable of participating, in aggregations in New York. So definitely further examination in New York is probably necessary.
Yeah, we got a project for it this year.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aaron. And one last distinction, I think, for everybody on the call is I will just, again, remind everybody that there is dramatic similarity in a vast amount of what happens in the United States. Call it 85 to 92% of our network is a grid. It's interconnected, distribution, all the different pieces, but it's not a true network like downtown Chicago, downtown New York. And the requirements that somebody may make on that type of a very difficult to manage network solution versus the rest of the infrastructure, we want to always be aware of that and not try to draw large comparatives with what may be necessary between those two very different types of electric systems across the United States. Thank you again, Aaron. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank
So
you.
second question, Emily, was where?
Also in the chat, and it was from Eric. Do you see it? Question on slide 16. I can also unmute you, Eric, so you can elaborate. Where are you? There you go.
Yeah, go ahead and summarize, Eric. And I just finished reading, but go ahead. Do you want to just kind of summarize the question?
Yeah, sure. Eric Hans with the Michigan PSC. So I guess I'm trying to connect the Ontario example that you talked about, where it seems like the ideal is like having some kind of common media authority and being able to share data back and forth. But I think what the RTOs are doing, at least the two that are in my state, are kind of doing their own separate thing, and they've locked into that path at this point. They're seem to be really dealing with their their wholesale compliance and dealing with that data flows through their own processing platforms essentially, and then kind of leaving it to the retail entities to figure it out from there. So I guess my question is there still, or do you still see a benefit of doing something like a statewide type of, register your platform, whatever noun you want to use, or like just the retail piece of the system and linking that up to what each RTO is doing?
Yeah, I think so. I think that what we have seen fundamentally again is, look, I love my industry. We've all been inside of this and worked in the utility space, and but we heavily do the not invented here just because it's hard to work across a large group of people, right? And so it's just simpler for us to go our own way. And that thought process is creating dramatic cost implications. And at some point, the state regulators are going to have to stand up and say enough. This just happened with retail views of renewable energy credits. We started out, we grew to custom systems from utilities to manage RECs, private systems, shared systems, nonprofit systems. We're now down to I think 12 to 14 of those systems, but hundreds of millions of dollars were spent and then thrown away when everybody's like, look, we can't have 90 systems to manage RECs. We need to have one for whatever, MISO, ERCOT. We need to have a system to do that. This is the same in spades for DER. And so this thought process of not having at least a statewide system, every state is going to be hammered with dramatic cost implications. And it's not like it's not known. This just happened with the REC trading systems, right? I mean, you've got a real-time example just a few years ago, watching this whole thing blow up and then start to try to consolidate again. But this is largely going to be a state regulator discussion. They're either going to make the decision that they want to try to have a single point of truth and lower cost for all the constituents in their state, or they're going to let it run rampant and let costs continue to escalate with thousands of independent systems. So I think the only real conversation here is state regulators making a choice and taking a very proactive view on saying, we can't sustain these kind of costs anymore, and you all are going to have to figure out how to work together, and this is how we're going to move that forward.
Let me add to that in a sense, Eric, getting back to your examples of both MISO and PJM. What they are proposing is essentially enhanced versions of what they've had already. PJM has had a demand response hub for a number of years, in which allows for, according to the rules, that all demand response resources need to be registered as part of an aggregation, and that information needs to be there. Similarly, I believe that MISO is developing a similar system. These are systems designed to support registration of DERs in the PJM and MISO programs.
For market product transactions.
For market product transactions. So these are not, designed for use for the retail utility per se, or for state oversight, or for, really getting a sense of what are the other resources and services that can be provided at the state level, whether that's VPPs being provided to provide distribution system services. So there are a number of reasons besides ones Chris already mentioned, that having a statewide or at least a common registry that is useful for all parties and not just for the wholesale purposes that PJM needs or MISO needs.
Thank you. That is very clear, and I see you guys are recording this, so that is very good for me to pass along to others. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Do I need to switch to Q&A, Emily?
Yes. So the final couple questions are from Jordan Graham, and that's in the Q&A section.
So Jordan, do you want to take Jordan off mute and let them just summarize?
Yep. I'm currently allowing it. All right. You should be permitted to speak.
Hey folks, Jordan Graham from Tesla. I wanted to know about whether what authority the RTOs and ISOs have to move away from the DERA being the point of aggregation, or I guess I should clarify that, to require additional metering at the resource level. And so, for instance, you could say that we are going to aggregate and have the DERA be the point of aggregation and the point of metering, but you also need to meter the individual resources as well. And if there are metering accuracy requirements within the RTO ISO, do they apply to the DERA as a whole, or do they apply to the individual resources at that point?
Thank you, Jordan. This is a great question. So let me start with size matters. And so again, the thought process, we've had a lot of debates, Australia, Ireland, Germany, California, different places, on like home DER aggregation. And they're like, oh, we're going to aggregate by program, by HVACs, by electric vehicles, by this. And so I'm like, oh, you're going to have 7 aggregators in every residential home providing 1 kW each, and all are going to have conflicting methodologies based on the program they're enrolled in. Folks, it's not going to work, right? That's not reality. Having an aggregator per site to a certain scale, whether I'll use the ERCOT example, where the rep or the aggregator for that site need to be coordinated, and they have to figure that out for a residential site, right? You can't have 7 people with 7 different programs trying to make equipment do different things for different programs behind a single customer meter. Number one, how are you going to measure it, right? So you sub-meter all of the HVAC systems and the EV charger, and then the heat pump, and then the pool pump, and everybody provides their data and tries to measure that against what? You can't create a baseline at a residential home meter for demand response if you have an active resource injection from batteries or solar. So these thought processes of reality of math, there is a size variation here that the industry is going to have to make a ruling on, and basically say up to a certain size, you're going to have to use, whether it's a single meter or you can have sub-metering under it to balance the different things. But the end of the day, you're going to have to be able to do those measurement pieces according to the current requirements. And if that's ANSI revenue grade metering for this particular thing for a utility retail program, that's going to be the requirement. Above that, if you go to whatever, a giant chemical processing facility, and they've got 2,000 megawatt generation facilities, quote, behind the meter, it's on their property. They're doing demand response for 7 of their facilities, and they're doing batteries over here as a backup, but they're making them available to the grid. It's a completely different scenario, and that is a scale resource greater than 5 megawatts that is going to need to be governed by resource, right? So two completely separate conversations where it may make sense that a specific resource is large enough that it can be governed by a resource, even though there's 9 different resources on a site. The scale of those resources are impactful enough to the grid that they can be managed on a resource basis. And so there's just having these conversations generically sometimes are very difficult, but industry is going to have to make a decision about size here and be able to move this conversation in a legitimate way to address that on a size basis, not necessarily on a uniform basis for all DERs, because they have very different effects on the reliability and resiliency of the grid based on their scale size. Does that help?
I see David talking. I think he's muted though.
I am. I was muted. So just to specifically, I think a question was a good one, which was about, what about the, what in order to meet the aggregator telemetry requirement, what is needed about pulled from individual DERs? And I think that's a good, outstanding question. In that, in how the requirement that FERC put is that make sure that you can provide that the 6-second or 2-second. It didn't say how it was going to be provided from the aggregator from his DERs. But if I remember correctly, there is a audit capability that the aggregator will need to collect and keep the information in order to demonstrate that the information they are provided from all the DERs is capable of backstopping of what they actually submitted. So there will need to be some work to develop what is the right accuracy level, what are the various alternative methods of collecting, and how can they meet the same accuracy as required by the RTO and ISO. So I think it's a very important ongoing question.
And I think a good rule of thumb that everybody can walk away from is just from an economic viability standpoint, high resolution telemetry, 6 seconds or lower, with a full secure ICCP requirement in that constraint for transmission from a site is going to be, kind of a break-even analysis around 5 megawatts. If you just have the higher resolution without the ICCP from each site, you could have, let's say an aggregator has their own NOC, and that NOC has one ICCP tunnel to the authority, but they can bring the data back to them across a variety of different ways from all their different resources at that higher resolution and provide that summary data to the organization. That break-even point is going to be around 2 megawatts on a per site basis for that extended capability for that telemetry equipment. Those are really good rules of thumb. Everybody will go crazy on, oh no, it's 1.2 or it's 7.9 but just ballpark 5 and 2 megawatts. That's going to be the reality of it. And so if you want to have capable enabled DER policy, if you're asking for this high level resolution, secure transmission and data requirements for things under 5 megawatts, it's not going to make economic sense for them to participate.
Thank you. These are helpful answers.
Did anything else come in, Emily?
I haven't seen anything else. So.
And we're way over time, aren't we? Sorry.
Yeah, we're about 10 minutes over. But if anyone else has questions, you can definitely reach out to us either through the contact form on the FERC 2222 website, or I just put up the introduction slide as well. That has all of our emails as well. So yeah, feel free to reach out to us, and I guess I'll wrap this up. But thank you all so much again for attending, and it was great to have everyone participate.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.